Okay, our last speakers are Ebohr Figueroa and Allison Johnson. Allison and Ebohr are from Converge International, which is one of the major providers of employee assistance programs in industry. So they come with a wealth of knowledge with their experiences with in assisting people, and I'd like to ask them both to come up to the stage now.
Okay, good afternoon. We're going to do a tag team here. So off we go. Last spot before lunch, and I appreciate people are probably getting hungry, and let's just give you maybe a bit more information to sort of whet that appetite for some discussion over lunch. So look, we work in the area of employee assistance programs. That involves, for the most part, providing a range of different counselling and support services for staff and their family members. Just if you think about the proportion of people who access, for example, employee assistance counselling, do you think the reason why they access that is mostly for work-related reasons or for other reasons, personal reasons? What would you think? Work or other reasons? Other reasons. Okay, so obviously probably not such a hard question, but important for suicide prevention because it's an example where you've got the workplace, which Lucy, you placed close to the centre, bridging the gap between inside and outside work. Very clear and simple example. In terms of what we're going to be looking at in this session, it's understanding suicide in relation to the events that impact on workers. Those impacts are variable, whether it's the person who has contemplated or attempted suicide or even taken their own life, their family members, their co-workers, and the way in which that they're impacted. And we'll be looking at the way in which the organisation can best respond to those incidents, how they can support the recovery both at the time and importantly, anticipating, managing and learning from those. Interesting just to think of the different speakers that we've listened to today. Gus, in the example of his cousin who was married to a close friend of his and how her life was changed from a critical incident. So in the work that we do, we actually come in at a particular point, and while we're addressing an actual event, it cascades both in terms of reflecting on what could have been and then what we can do in the future. So that's the door that we're walking in for this session, but it's really looking at it in a more a holistic way. So keeping that in mind, the three areas that we're going to look at, starting with the exclamation mark there is just saying that that's the critical incident. So that's the way in which we might respond. It's not always to a suicide, it could be to an attempt or to someone who is really very unwell at that particular time. So tends to be quite reactive, and while it's predictable, you don't know when it's going to happen. So we'll be focusing on that. We'll then look at the way in which managers in particular can provide the support in the moment and afterwards to those impacted. And then importantly, when you've got that opportunity to step back, reflect and learn, how is this actually helping us to both prevent in future, but importantly to recognise the good things that we're already doing that actually come into play here. Because in some of the examples that we'll give, it'll demonstrate where the actions that you're putting in place in prevention come into the fore at that exclamation mark. So that's the plan. And so we'll present a few stats here and I'll pass over to Allison.
I think that the stats are really, really interesting, and what we've tried to provide to you today are not the general stats that you've heard, but our own internal stats. You know, when we look at critical incident service delivery and EAPs, we're actually looking at a large industry base right across all sectors. and Converge International last year provided around over 800 critical incident service deliveries for organisations that we provide EAP for. Some that we don't necessarily provide EAP for, but some who may not have their own EAP provider, but a critical incident has occurred and we're actually called in to provide those immediate services. We, at Converge International, in those 800 critical incidents, 17.6 were actually related to suicide. You know, that's quite high, because really for Converge International it was close to 150 suicides that related to suicide itself, related to attempted suicide, and also related to ideation as well. So they're quite large. We then went on to look at the construction industry, particularly, and what we actually noticed was that in a 4-year period, just our organisation, we responded to around 30 suicide critical interventions, which is obviously quite high for us as one provider, because when we sort of drill down further into our own service provision and we look at the access to EAP of the employee population, it is only 1.25%. Now that means that only 1.25 out of 100% will actually access an EAP service, a counselling service. And what that means is that 98.75% of employee population may be at risk, and you don't know that. So for us as an EAP provider and as our consultants who actually identify primary presenting issues at that EAP presentation. Now remember that we're not a diagnostic service, we're actually a solution-focused service. So it's not surprising that when we look at only 6.4% of people who come into EAP, of that 1.25% are actually coming with a diagnosed depressive disorder. We know that when we look at emotional ill health, that the percentage is much higher, and that's us as consultants that are actually identifying that there is something around mental health that is a concern. We also know that one of the big issues that are presenting is relationship issues, and we've certainly heard today about that one being the significant factors of people actually suiciding. So these are quite concerning. So when we know that a critical incident occurs in a workplace, we also know that people are exposed to events that are outside the realm of normal. We also know that sometimes the stress response impacts people quite significantly from an emotional, psychological, behavioural and physiological situation. So when we actually say, well, what is a critical incident and what is critical incident stress? So we can see there a definition about what actually constitutes a critical incident. So that's something that happens, that's unexpected. We weren't thinking it was going to happen tomorrow, next week, next day, or even this morning. So often organisations are actually left quite unawares and having to respond pretty quickly. Critical incident stress is we say it's a normal reaction to an abnormal event. We know that people are actually impacted quite significantly, and all aspects of their well-being can be impacted at that particular time. We know that some of those reactions are extremely strong and leave people feeling very unsafe and can leave people feeling very, very vulnerable as well. And sometimes the impact and how it actually spreads out in organisations is those people that are directly impacted, but those people who may hear about the event a little bit later and are more indirectly impacted. But the thing about human beings and knowing each each person in this room, or not knowing each person in this room, is we don't know what we bring into our workplaces. We actually don't know what people have experienced or how they might actually be triggered by a critical incident.
So, in terms of picking that up, no critical incident is the same, and the different elements that we need to keep into account. Look, one of the reasons why it's important to put in place your prevention and protocols, which we'll look at in a moment, is because you need to have the flexibility to respond to the different needs of every situation. If you look at it in terms of breaking down, so a suicide event that's impacting either in the workplace or a worker. So it doesn't have to have happened at work. Every situation will be different. And the key things that will come up as an example will be people asking themselves, why didn't I respond to, or how did we respond to, for example, a red flag? People will respond differently because of their pre-existing relationships, how close they are to people. What else is going on at the time? There's been a number of examples talking about the importance of work. What about if there's a restructure, a change, a conflict, a bullying incident? All of these things change the context and will direct the way in which you respond to that particular incident. You look at the organisation itself and understanding what does the organisation have in place. Sorry, we're having issues with this, but don't worry. So how does the organisation communicate the event? How does it communicate the suicide to the workplace? How does that come through from the managers? What is the history of the way in which this organisation has dealt with incidents, and what if incidents have been clustered, which does actually occur as well, whether it's in an industry or in a region, which someone alluded to before around high schools on the northern beaches. All of these things will direct the way in which you respond to those situations. So that's two different layers, and then we go to what Allison's just picked up, which is the individual, the person who's there and impacted. And just, if you want to add a bit more to that.
Yeah, I guess, again, relationship breakdown is one of those areas, and I'll give you an example of a critical incident soon that I've attended a number of years ago, which is really an example of that relationship breakdown. We do know that people that are experiencing those sorts of things are at higher risk of suicide. We don't know what is in the workplace. As I said to you, 78.75% is unknown to us in terms of what risks of mental health are actually there. But we do know that people in the workplace are experiencing mental health issues, and you may not know about it. So we do know that that's a concern. We do know that there are significant life changes that all of us actually experience. We know that we're all touched by people with terminal illness, and we all experience grief and loss at some time in our life. But there's other things that actually impact us as well, such as issues with our children, or again, family breakdown as well, also important. Our exposure to previous trauma, we know that when people are actually exposed to trauma and multiple times, some people have really, really good coping and self-care strategies, but unfortunately some people have really maladaptive coping strategies, and when they are traumatised, they often reach out for those, such as alcohol or other drugs. We do know, as I mentioned just a minute ago, we do know that people's coping style and sometimes their personality are really important factors when looking at risk and how people are impacted by critical incidents. Here's just a few examples, and certainly not limited to, but it's really to just give you an idea of what people can experience. Mood changes. There is a massive dumping of hormones into our bodies when we go into flight and fight response when there is a critical incident. And a lot of people feel very, very uncomfortable about that, and often because they don't understand it. Those very significant hormones can impact our sleep. They they can impact just the way that we function, our ability to concentrate and focus. So these things are really important as well.
Okay. So, in terms of bringing this together, I guess Allison's setting the scene in terms of the immediate effects, the potential for that, the critical incident, which is the suicide, which of course is the reason that brings us all here today, then cascades to other potential impacts. So the role of the workplace is crucial. This is what we presented at the beginning today, and a lot of the presenters have been highlighting the way in which these different elements come together. So all of the prevention, the awareness strategies, the management strategies, all of those things around making the resources available, and the culture which makes these accessible is crucial. So I probably won't highlight that too much more because it really builds on the other speakers. So we're going to present an example which highlights some of these different elements. So you look at the critical incident itself, so the suicide, the attempted suicide. What is it that the workplace has in place? More generally, how does the workplace respond to mental health issues? And then specifically, how you respond to the event. Who provides the support? How are issues communicated? How are the managers provided with resources? How do you debrief and review afterwards? How do you make available the immediate services and the follow-up services? How do you close off those matters to support the recovery? How do you link this back to your mental health awareness and strategies? A number of key elements.
Yeah, we'll just move on.
Yep, okay.
Yeah.
So the role of managers, cascading it down.
I just want to quickly give you an example of a critical incident that I actually attended a number of years ago now. It was down the south coast. I'd been called in the day after this critical event, and a man in his 40s, well known to the organisation, had a significant relationship breakdown where he was now estranged from his wife and his children. He had actually mentioned in the workplace that he was really struggling. The workplace really understood that this was a struggle for him and that he really was not coping. He had actually said a couple of times, I might as well just go out there and top myself. People responded in a very caring way. On this particular day, he got a call from police to say that he needed to attend the local police station at a particular time at lunchtime because there'd been allegations of domestic violence. He let his manager know that he was very upset. He was clearly upset, very visibly upset. And on the way out, he let the receptionist know that the situation was really bad and he might as well go out and just top himself. And she responded in a very caring way, saying, you know, I'm sure it'll be okay. About 2 hours later, the police arrived at the workplace. He hadn't arrived at the police station, nor had he arrived back at work. On the way, he stopped in the bush and he killed himself. When I attended the next day, it was really, really interesting because my brief was to provide group psychoeducation, meet and greet while we're here, and to provide one-on-one support. The manager was wanting to get this done pretty quickly. He needed to get jobs done, and there were a lot of people crying. And in actual fact, he was pretty uncomfortable. So out of 25 people that attended for the group psychoeducation, 2 responded and came to see me one-on-one. One of them was the receptionist. And we'll just put that slide back up because... was the other way? That's fine. No, it's fine. Do you remember the slide that we just showed about the symptoms? The guilt was enormous. I can promise you the guilt was enormous. The employee group felt quite detached from management, and they didn't feel comfortable in coming on one-on-one. They really needed to get back to their desk and do what they needed to do. So I spent two sessions with 2 people, did what I could do, and then I spent probably close to 2 hours with the manager. And we'll just go to this slide that Ebohr put up a minute ago, which I think is really, really important. What I actually did with the manager was a lot of management coaching. That manager had a lot of guilt himself, but that he was not comfortable in actually showing his own innate response to what had actually occurred. And the only thing he knew how to do was to just let's get on with the job. What he didn't do was model behaviour that gave people permission to actually grieve in the way that they needed to grieve. And grief from suicide is extremely complex. What he also was aware of was that his own innate sense about his own value and belief system about what suicide was, i.e. it was selfish. He obviously felt that the person that had suicided was not very thoughtful about his children and his wife. So his own value, belief systems came into how he interacted with his team. So what do? We actually provide really practical first aid response. The primary thing is to make people feel safe, to actually look after their practical needs. They sometimes feel sick in the tummy, so they don't eat, they don't drink, and they're not thinking properly. So those really practical needs, emotional support, just sitting with somebody is really, really important, and maybe not even talking. We don't have to fix the problem. We need to provide them really practical information. We need to be able to let them know what has actually occurred so that they can deal with reality rather than their own perception about the events. And sometimes in workplaces, we're challenged with that because of privacy and confidentiality. But we also want to encourage them to use their own social supports and their own natural adaptive coping styles. But keeping in mind, sometimes people don't have adaptive coping styles. Sometimes they actually have quite maladaptive coping styles. And in the construction industry, sometimes it's down the pub and a belly full of alcohol. So we really need to be able to provide some really good information about these sorts of things. I have had the privilege of working with mates in construction before on quite a significant critical incident involving suicide. I'm not going to go into that today. But I have to say the support on the ground was absolutely amazing, and they made an enormous difference to actually normalising the workforce to come and speak with people like me. So bringing in other external organisations such as your EAP is really, really important. Yeah.
Okay, so look, just to, we'll wrap up time-wise, but in a sense to pull this part of it together is about saying the bits that the components of your strategy in terms of the prevention, the awareness and the skills which have come across from the previous presenters. You can see how they come into play right here in an example that Allison is speaking about. So the elements that seem like what we're doing is providing a general mental health awareness has a very immediate and practical benefit for those impacted, but then moving forward. So those different components around prevention, around awareness and the resources available, including EAP and all of the support networks, really make a difference. So we'll finish there. Yeah.